When I arrived in Indiana to teach at the University of Notre Dame in 1980, I'd lived all my life in California and had not had a Catholic education, so everything seemed quite foreign. The first years of teaching in the English department, I struggled to connect with my students, to figure out who they were and what we had in common. In a course in 19th century American literature, we had reached the Transcendentalists, who were among my favorites when I was an undergraduate. I introduced Emerson and then Thoreau, and neither one elicited much interest. First, puzzled at the lack of enthusiasm, I then began to feel desperate, thinking that if I couldn't make these writers come alive, I might be doomed as a teacher at this university. The next writer on the syllabus was Whitman, and I redoubled my lecture preparation, constructing an elaborate set of analogies between him and Dante that would certainly break through to my Notre Dame students. To begin the lecture, I spoke about autobiographical parallels in the Commedia and Leaves of Grass, works that delve so deeply into the individual self that they reach the utterly common. Just as Dante's skillfully etched self-portrait, set in the midst of his tumultuous Florentine world, reimagines medieval Catholicism, so Whitman's rough and tumble self enters every level of American society, thus envisioning the full potential of democracy. And what about dedication to the vernacular? Dante's treatise on vernacular eloquence could easily have been the title of an essay by Whitman. Both were confident great poetry could be made in the language people actually speak, rather than requiring the authoritative cloak of an archaic language. And then I pointed out how Italian poetry arises out of the innovations of Dante, and American poetry flourishes on the ground Whitman tilled. At which point I began to notice many quizzical looks. So I stopped to ask, okay, fill me in. How many of you have read the Divine Comedy? 1.5 people raised their hands. I threw up my hands and thought, I'm never going to get it. Fortunately, over time, I found that the students and I did become able to hear one another and to share literary enthusiasms. As Duncan and Dante and Whitman all advise, we learned to speak the same vernacular, to meet at decisive points of human engagement. And now a little more formally to Duncan's Dante etudes. Robert Duncan, dates are 1919 to 1988, is a pivotal American poet of the post-World War II generation that first came to prominence in the 1960 anthology, The New American Poetry. Within the anthology, and then continuing for the rest of his life, Duncan was closely associated with the Black Mountain poets, especially Charles Olson, Robert Creeley, and Denise Levertov, a group that drew extensively on the Modernist legacy of Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams, among others. Duncan lived most of his life in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he had earlier participated with Kenneth Rexroth, Jack Spicer, and Robin Blazer in a movement called with mock grandiosity the San Francisco Renaissance. Aside from these allegiances, Duncan would invoke the broadest possible context for his poetry by calling himself a romantic poet, an affiliation he explained by insisting that modernism and postmodernism were essentially renovations of 19th century romanticism. Like many romantic poets, he viewed the imagination as the central force in art, but he refused to claim originality for his work, thus foregoing a characteristic romantic marketing strategy. Instead, he conscientiously maintained that he was a derivative poet, for whom writing is always a form of imaginative reading. Along with Shakespeare and Whitman, Dante is one of Duncan's primary sources of derivation, to whom he returns for inspiration again and again. As a self-proclaimed love poet, Duncan refers directly in his work to scenes of love and desire in the Vita Nuova and the Commedia. More inventively, he finds ways to bring Dante into conversation with contemporary poets and artists and political realities, as when, for instance, he writes a poem about the Watts Towers, an amazing work of vernacular architecture in Los Angeles, and its creator, Simon Rodia, and titles it Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Duncan also spoke publicly about Dante by giving a lecture to celebrate the 700th anniversary of Dante's birth, The Sweetness and Greatness of Dante's Divine Comedy in 1965, which he later published as an essay. In another essay, Man's Fulfillment in Order and Strife from 1969, haunted by the Vietnam War, Dante provides the model for a poet who during a time of conflict has a vision capacious enough to encompass the entire world order. In aesthetic terms, Duncan's poetics draws deeply from Dante's theory of language as polysemous, as having many meanings, and he likewise promotes the stylistic benefits of vernacular eloquence. He repeatedly orients his compass to il ben dell'intelletto, the good of the intellect, enshrined in Canto 3 of the Inferno as the crucial power of moral discrimination that is forfeited by those who choose the downward path in life. Duncan also reads Dante as a precursor to his own philosophical tradition, American pragmatism, in which, as in the writings of William James and John Dewey, experience is both subject and mode of inquiry. As Duncan says, Dante's insistence upon the literal, the actual, the human experience is pervasive. For him, as for Plato, an idea is a thing seen, and he is careful and concerned always to portray for us the terms of the experience. This scrupulous attention to reality, to human experience in all its philosophical implications, Duncan contends, makes possible the vast allegorical, theological, and symbolic reach of Dante's poetry. During the final 20 years of his life, Duncan wrote a long book of poetry called Groundwork, which he published initially in 2 volumes, Before the War in 1984 and In the Dark in 1988. In Groundwork, he engages more explicitly and extensively than previously with foundational poets from many of the world's traditions. In 2 series in particular, a 17th century suite in homage to the metaphysical genius in English poetry, and the Dante Etudes, he cites and responds to specific works by earlier poets. Speaking of these 2 series, in the introduction to Groundwork, the poet Michael Palmer characterizes the peculiar intensity of Duncan's investment in his sources. And now I'm going to share my screen, and from here on out, we'll have the quotations to look at. That is the first publication of the Dante Etudes as a little fascicle, which I'll explain in a moment. But here's the first quotation. It is an immediacy both fervent and desperate in its effort to capture a moment of atemporal transmission, exchange, circulation. What we arrive at is an ardent contact between voices across time, a conversation about life experience, artistic imagination, eternal bafflement, in which each text is altered by the presence of the other. In the case of the Dante Etudes, the conversation between Duncan and Dante centers on Dante's lesser-known prose works, but the colloquy is also enlivened by the presence of another poet at the table, Walt Whitman. In a contemporaneous essay about Whitman, Duncan speaks of the highly suggestive convergence of poetics and politics in his 2 interlocutors. He says, Whitman in Democratic Vistas, like Dante in De Monarchia, had written a definitive, even the definitive, politics of his time. Duncan then enhances this comparison by noting historical contrasts between the poetic projects of Dante and Whitman. Dante was writing the monumental memorial of a perished hope, the mausoleum of Christendom, even as Shakespeare was to write the mausoleum of Renaissance man, of the magician or prince. Whitman did not believe he came at the end of a civilization, but at the beginning, even before the beginning. America, for Whitman, is yet to come. Already, we see that the fervent and desperate dialogues Duncan conducts with his precursors, which will be the subject of the rest of this talk, do not enforce concurrence, but rather allow for striking differences and even disagreements. A confirmed follower of Heraclitus, to whom he alludes in the title of the essay cited above, Man's Fulfillment in Order and Strife, and in the title image for his contemporaneous volume of poetry, Bending the Bow, Duncan recognizes the forces of harmony and discord as equally potent in both poetry and politics, and he makes room for their interplay in all his writing. Duncan's multifaceted encounter with Dante in the Dante Etudes has received incisive commentary by three poet critics, Nathaniel Mackey, Stephen Collis, and J. Peter Moore. Mackey emphasizes how the Dante Etudes act as at once poetry and poetics, especially through their core assertion that, quote, poetry and community coincide, unquote. He points to a circuitous quality in which poetry is not just an aesthetic realm, but a ground for the conduct of the life it chronicles, and sees it as arising from the derivational impulse that has characterized Duncan's writing from the start. It is, he says, an inclination to understand his own experience and artistic practice in the light of precedents found in the works of others. Collis elucidates further the stakes involved in Duncan's writing of poetry as an imaginative reading of another poet, adducing one of Duncan's oft-repeated pronouncements: responsibility is to keep the ability to respond. Furthermore, Collis notes, Duncan's sense of poetic and critical responsibility implies the kind of honing of skills indicated by the term etude. One keeps the ability to respond by practicing it. In this case, that is, by responding to a panoply of images, concepts, and terms from Dante's prose. Moore compares in detail the ways Dante and Duncan understand the vernacular as a first or common language. For both poets, Moore contends, the vernacular does not refer to folk speech, or as Duncan calls it, the jargon of the low, but rather to primary speech, i.e., to what is learned in childhood and shared as common across humanity. I wish to augment these insights about the Dante Etudes by looking at the ways Duncan intermingles his readings of Dante with those of Whitman, as he seeks to bring poetry and community into alignment during the early 1970s, amid the crisis of democracy provoked by the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, and the Watergate scandal from 1972 to 1974, and the ecological crisis commemorated by the inauguration of Earth Day in 1970. Duncan first studied Dante within medieval and Renaissance history in the UC Berkeley classroom of the emigre historian Ernst Kantorowicz, and he drew upon these studies in poems such as the early sequence Medieval Scenes, written in 1947. 3 decades later, he returned to Dante and to Whitman with new urgency in his desire to probe the proper relationship between poetry and politics. One result of this desire can be found in explicitly political poems such as Uprising and The Soldiers, which denounce in the most strident terms what Duncan sees as betrayals of democracy and human rights by the American government and its military. At the same time, he asserts that no rhetoric, no matter how righteous or convincing, should be thought to transcend the practice of poetry as it takes place within the individual poem. Duncan invoked his belief in the primacy of poetry over the suasive power of rhetoric most stridently in letters he wrote reproving his close friend and fellow Black Mountain poet Denise Levertov for her activist poetry and her impassioned appearance at anti-war rallies. He admonished her for not recognizing that poetry is the most encompassing form of life, which therefore includes politics, and his denunciations provoked a painful breach between the two poets that never fully healed. During this time of crisis, some of it self-provoked, Duncan sought sustenance from the literary giants who had accompanied him throughout his career. In particular, he invited Dante and Whitman to converse with one another in his poetry and essays, tying Dante's monarchical theory in ways that seem at first counterintuitive to Whitman's projections of democratic fulfillment. Duncan pairs the poets repeatedly in poems and several essays, especially in two essays ostensibly about Whitman, Changing Perspectives in Reading Whitman from 1968 and 69, and The Adventure of Whitman's Line from 1978. In his writing at this time, Duncan connects Dante to Whitman with respect to language, love, self-creation, and a politics of wholeness that extends beyond nations and even beyond the human species. To state a little more fully these points of connection, Duncan joins his two great interlocutors in exploring the proper language for poetry, an exalted form of the vernacular. Like them, he submits willingly to the commanding power of love, invoking the range of its registers from the erotic to the social to the spiritual, and he embarks on the foundational political task of self-creation, which by its very comprehensiveness opens the individual out to what is common to humanity and ultimately to all creatures, striving thus to preserve individual sovereignty while promoting the health of a boundless community. And now I move into the second part. The writing of the Dante Etudes began as an assignment Duncan accepted indirectly from the dying poet Charles Olson, who asked his friends to undertake a series of pamphlets that together would offer what he called a curriculum of the soul. As Peter Quartermain explains, in February 1968, Olson sent George Butterick a plan for a curriculum of the soul. John Clark, who had been teaching Olson's course on mythology at SUNY Buffalo since Olson's 1965 departure, subsequently selected 29 topics from Olson's plan to be published as fascicles. He assigned number 8, Dante, to Duncan. The fascicle, first published by the Institute for Further Studies in 1974, occupies 47 pages in Duncan's collected later poems and plays, and is divided into 3 books and a coda. As a pamphlet in Olson's series, the Dante Etudes was proposed as one of a number of exemplary texts meant to inspire an alternative university in which poetry and poetic modes of interpretation would take center stage in the pursuit of knowledge. Although Olson is best known to readers of poetry for his essay on poetics, projective verse, and for his epic, the Maximus poems, he is perhaps equally famous in larger circles for being the third and final rector of Black Mountain College, which ran from 1933 to 1957, the experimental institution that jump-started the avant-garde arts in America at mid-century. As an educator, Olson was passionate in imagining alternative curricula that would promote both individual and social flourishing, thus following the example of John Dewey, the American pragmatist philosopher of democracy and education, who had in fact inspired the founding of Black Mountain College. Duncan's ardent poetic companionship with Olson, which included teaching at Black Mountain College in 1956 at Olson's behest, was roughly analogous to the dynamic relationship of Dante and Guido Cavalcanti. Seen in this way, the Black Mountain poets function as a group like the Renaissance stilnovisti, whose new style, in this case, was called projectivism. In both movements, the poets and their works are as inextricably connected as are form and content within their individual poems. Like Dante, Duncan legitimizes his contemporary group by invoking classic precursors, in his case, Dante and Whitman. Of course, as with any group, solidarity in the face of rival groups can be readily matched by internal discord. Back in 1953, Olson had already written a letter to Duncan, later published as the essay Against Wisdom as Such, disparaging occult and religious beliefs rampant in San Francisco, and worrying that Duncan had fallen prey to them and thus might betray poetry's intellectual primacy and its need to address the present moment. Unlike the disastrous outcome of Duncan's later assertion that Levertov throws over poetry in favor of politics, Olson's letter evoked both self-defense and fruitful self-critique in Duncan's poetry and prose for many years. At base, Duncan's relationship with Olson and the challenge Olson issued of finding a wisdom appropriate to poetry is the germ that gives rise to the Dante Etudes. Duncan acknowledges this explicitly in the last poem in Book 3 of the Etudes, which ends the fascicle version. He titles it, "And a Wisdom as Such," and tags it an etude from the fourth treatise of the Convivio, chapters 27 and 21. The Convivio is a kind of vernacular encyclopedia, and in the first of the two chapters cited, Dante discusses the qualities the great soul acquires in old age, in which wisdom amassed from a life well lived is cast abroad into the world. Dante's poem thus begins, "And a wisdom as such, a loosening of energies and every gain, for good, a rushing in place of God, if it be. Open out like a rose that can no longer keep its center closed, but practicing for death, let's go. Let's go, littering the ground with petals of its rhyme, and spreads abroad the last perfume which has been generated within." Olson frets in his letter that Duncan might abrogate the power of poetry by invoking the authority of a symbol or doctrine other than, quote, his one, his self, the man or woman he is, unquote. If Duncan were to succumb to this temptation, Olson argues, God does rush in and art is washed away, turned into that second force, religion. Although himself never a true believer in either religion or the occult, Duncan refuses to pose a hard demarcation between art and the spiritual as forms of imagination. He follows Dante by reading poetry and the spiritual in the most expansive ways, allowing them to inform his deepest experiences of being human. Contra Olson's fear that he will become a sectary and his poetry succumb to a diversionary force, Duncan maintains that he, like Dante, insists upon the literal, the actual, the human experience. In this poem, he promotes an experiential wisdom that may be earned as one begins to let go of life in old age. Inhabiting the image of the rose past its prime, the aging poet achieves a vision of a meaning that is lurking everywhere but also vanishing, littering the ground with petals of its rhyme. In Duncan's poetics, rhyme, his preferred spelling for what we usually spell R-H-Y-M-E, is a feeling for potentially endless correspondences of sound and meaning. Here, it is distilled by grief and the imminence of death into an attar that seeps out effortlessly from an unstoppered vial. In a melange of the senses, the rhyme, the perfume, is also a form of harmony, of music, as Duncan makes clear in the preface to the Dante Etudes. The poems are, he says, etudes rather than studies because they are proposed in poetry as the etudes of romantic composers were proposed in music, unquote. Preferring the tune etude to study, Duncan views his poems not as sketches, but as finished compositions, like the etudes of Chopin, Liszt, and Debussy. Inspired by citations drawn from Dante's lesser-read prose works, especially his political writing, Duncan studies Dante's thought in a mode of creative interpretation that might be called midrashic in order to translate it into a politics of democracy for his own time. It's here, as presiding presences in a realm of poems, that I read his Principium, his Civitas, and Monarchia to be. Whatever they once were in a world of popes, city-states, and emperors, they remain, translated powers, present today in the state of volunteered individualities and social consciences and responsibilities, true to my sense of our good. Each member princely in his regard and mine, or else democracy lacks rule, each member a worker for the good of all. Invoking Dante as surprisingly a proponent of anarchist communalism, Duncan implicitly joins him to the poet for whom the individual self is guarantor of the common good within democracy, Walt Whitman. Acknowledging that poetry and politics intertwine in the works of great poets, Duncan believes that Dante's version of this union must speak as urgently to us as does that of the prophet of American democracy, whose Song of Myself posits individual sovereignty as productive of social conscience and responsibility. On the next section. In the first book of the Dante Etudes, a run of 4 poems parses phrases from the opening chapters of Dante's Monarchia, reading them as addressing current conditions in American political and cultural life. Phrases from Dante's text are cited for titles to these poems: Of Empire, The Meaning of Each Particular, The Whole Potentiality, and The Work. The Monarchia was written to support the campaign of Can Grande, Dante's former patron, to keep Pope John XXII and his Guelph supporters from usurping political power from the Holy Roman Emperor and the pro-imperial Ghibellines. Dante's contention, in brief, is that monarchy arises from the natural order instituted by God, and that political power is rightly concentrated there rather than in the papacy. What interests Duncan in Monarchia are not the anachronistic claims of monarchy and empire over those of papal power, but rather the political perspective on human and natural flourishing that results. Reading Dante's closely reasoned argument, Duncan is especially taken with inferences about the relations of parts to wholes. These inferences resonate with Duncan's own views on 3 of his major concerns: Darwinian evolution, democratic pluralism, and the heterogeneous form of collage in the arts. Drawing out some of these implications, the poem, The Meaning of Each Particular, begins, "The truth of each particular, of the local, belongs to the goal, is of the entire civilization of the human race, beyond us. How many essential parts of the story we belong to, we will never know. And only in the imagination of the whole, the immediate percept is to be justified." And the poem concludes with a passage punctuated by Duncan with additional breath spaces from Book 1, Chapter 3 of Monarchia. "And since that same potentiality cannot all be reduced to actuality at the same time by one man, or by any of the limited associations distinguished above, there must needs be multiplicity in the human race in order for the whole of this potentiality to be actualized thereby." For both Duncan and Dante, the part not only belongs to the whole, but achieves its fulfillment therein, such that human beings find their purpose in imagining their participation in the entire civilization of the human race. For both poets, the particular does not lose its identity in the whole, but rather is justified in it. The whole, made up of uncountable particulars, cannot be known, but it can be imagined, and that is the poet's job and the goal of human flourishing. Duncan takes Dante's conception of humanity as transnational, as possessing attributes not subsumable within a particular nation, and equates it with Whitman's thinking about democracy. Discussing the writing of the poem The Soldiers, one of his own explicitly anti-war poems, Duncan says, "I came to read Whitman's lines, 'The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem,' and 'Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth,' in a new inspiration. Whitman's genius here is oracular, prophetic. Prophetic, that is, of a politics that is creative and inclusive rather than destructive and exclusive, in which all social forms, and not only those that favor one nation, must find a place. He remarks on Dante's espousal of a similar politics of the whole of humanity. Dante, in his De Monarchia, seeking the legitimacy of government and definition of man's good, finds that the legitimacy must lie in the ultimate goal of human civilization as a whole, in a civilization of civilizations. Is this not Whitman's greatest poem? Duncan goes on to elaborate, and Dante finds that the ultimate goal implies some function proper to humanity as a whole, for which that same totality of men is ordained in so great a multitude, to which function neither one man, nor one family, nor one district, nor one city-state, nor any individual kingdom may attain. May this not be Whitman's democracy, a people resonant with the poetry of their common intent? Finally, Duncan quotes from the same passage cited at the end of his poem, The Meaning of Each Particular. The goal or good of the people, Dante argues, is the fulfillment of their humanity. The specific potentiality of humanity as such is a potentiality or capacity of intellect. There must needs be multiplicity in the human race in order for the whole of this potentiality to be actualized thereby. Duncan recruits a contribution by Dante to a poetics he finds partially articulated in Whitman, a poetics of democratic communalism, which is a social expression of wholeness. When Duncan directs his thinking about parts and wholes into rewritings of Dante, such as, only in the imagination of the whole, the immediate percept is to be justified, he aligns Dante with the pragmatist notion that experience takes shape and meaning from its context, from the whole in which it is situated, a notion also present in Whitman's proto-pragmatism. Since the whole is always beyond immediate perception, imagining it involves a mental component, even a conceptual component, commitment to contextual awareness. As Duncan explains later in this poem, thus, Dante makes conception, primary, and perception to be of service, yes, but to the vision in which we conceive entireties. The whole is ultimately a kind of visionary aspiration that involves concepts and percepts, and Duncan's commitment to wholeness applies in three directions at once. To a politics of solidarity addressed to the unknowable totality of human beings, to a collage form in poetry that mimics this heterogeneous politics, and to an ecological totality that goes beyond the human to include all species. Speaking in his essay, Man's Fulfillment in Order and Strife, of a conjunction of politics, art, and biology, Duncan says of the Monarchia, the world order for Dante is a work of art. The eternal God, by his art, which is nature, brings into being the human race, he writes, in the which ultimate fittingness of every thing, being, or event is its contribution to the intent of the whole. God and nature makes naught superfluous, but all that comes into being is for some function. In terms of my own Darwinian persuasion, for I see creation as a process of evolution of forms, and these forms in turn as arising and surviving in a ground of individual variations and mutations, where multiplicity is not superfluous, but the necessary condition of potential functions. No created being is a final goal in the intention of the creator as creator, but rather is the proper function of that being the goal. Based on his conception of the world order as a work of art, Duncan extends the idea of nature as God's art into his own understanding of Darwinian evolution as an ongoing process of species creation, mutation, and destruction. Thus, world order acquires not only political and aesthetic, but also biological connotations. In this way, Duncan, like Dante and Whitman, offers a prophetic vision of the world order for his times. As he says in his first Whitman essay, we are in the throes of such an expansion of the imagination in time and space beyond the confine of established policies. A politics beyond cities and nations and civilizations claims our loyalties. This new politics of the late 1960s, which he seeks to embody and project in his poetry, is directed toward the whole of humanity and beyond that, toward the whole of nature. For those of us who believe in the unity of mankind, in a new anthropology that no longer thinks of different stages of man, of a progress from primitive to civilized, but in terms of different ways of being man, for those of us who further believe in the unity of living beings, the very word humanity extends beyond our species to involve us in a largest democracy, in an allegiance to an ecological order. This democracy extends as far and deep in meaning as man's understanding of his realm, of his relation to the world extends. What we envision as being the well-being of nature becomes the condition of our humanity. It will never. When will it be settled? For Duncan, the politics of a poetry addressed to our times must include not only every possible human condition, but also an affective recognition through what Whitman calls adhesive love of the humanity that includes all species in an expanded democracy. The final poetic implication of this ecological reading of politics is that its imagination of the whole must be open-ended in form as in content. In this, Duncan seeks to make a distinction between Dante's perfectly fulfilled poetic form and Whitman's constantly emergent form. The Leaves of Grass having its form not as the Commedia had, as the paradigm of an existing eternal form, but as the ever-flowing, ever-self-creative ground of a process in which forces of awareness, self-awareness, of declaration, and of longing work and rework in the evolution of what they are, the evolution of a creative intention that moves not toward the satisfaction of some prescribed form, but towards the fulfillment of a multitude of possibilities out of its seed. Again, this evolutionary poetic form, which has often been called with respect to American poetry organic form, bears the impact of the politics of democracy. In this work of the new literature was democracy itself at work. Democracy, Whitman saw at work in the whole of evolution. Democracy was the politics of the ensemble, as Hegel's was the philosophy of the ensemble. And Whitman saw his Leaves of Grass as belonging to the poetics of the ensemblist. In the ensemble, heterogeneous elements coalesce into an uncontainable whole. In politics, the ensemble appears as democracy. In nature, as the web of the earth's species. In poetry, as the art of collage. In his early embrace of the ensemble, Whitman becomes the model for a collage poetry such as one finds in the Dante Etudes. Whitman was the poet of primary intuitions, says Duncan, ancestor of our own creative vision, our own vision of creation, where now we see all of life as unfoldings, the revelations of a field of potentialities and latencies towards species and individuals hidden in the DNA, a field of generations larger than our humanity. Back of our contemporary arts of the collagist, the assembler of forms, is the ancestral protean concept, wider and deeper, of the poet as devotee of the ensemble. The arts of the collagist are decisive for Duncan because they are his own. They combine his dedication to being a derivative poet with his sense of form as projective and his belief that the whole is uncontainable and ultimately one with nature. He aspires, as he states in the introduction to his previous book of poetry, Bending the Bow from 1968, to participate in a collage form that implicates all of poetry, and beyond that, the unnameable whole that is creation, or as he calls it, with echoes of Freud's id as erotic life force, the it. In this realm of men's languages, a poetry of all poetries, grand collage, I name it, having only the immediate event of words to speak for it. And this is the last section. The expansive realm of men's languages is a domain that Duncan seeks to inhabit alongside Whitman and Dante, and all three recognize its most expressive form as the vernacular. For these poets, the vernacular is the common language, which speaks eloquently in every time and place and through every created form. Thinking of Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia and of the myriad ways Whitman and Dante reach down to the core of human experience, Duncan writes, the realm of the arts, dance, music, poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture, from the earliest remains we know, from the cave paintings, are not products, but initiations of ways deep into the experience of the universe. There is no progress here, no civilization, but a culture in the sense of a medium in which new life grows. Speech itself, nowhere other than common, everywhere the source from which we derive our individuality. Like his precursors, Duncan regards the self-aware individual as the point of immediate access to the common life, just as he regards spoken language as a bodily expression of the common nature we share with all things. Discussing Duncan's lifelong investment in the poetics of the vernacular, J. Peter Moore explains, throughout his writings, he distinguishes fake vernaculars from the true on the ground that fake vernaculars overinvest in the particularity of insular group affiliation, whereas true vernaculars convey both the irreducible particularity of individual experience and the aspiration for communication across lines of immediate political affiliation. True vulgar eloquence, he will come to proclaim, was speaking one's own language beyond class, beyond nationality, without effect, as if it were common language, the common language of all men in their humanity. In a poem from the Dante Etudes called A Little Language, Duncan seeks to expand the notion of an eloquent vernacular beyond the human species, or to extend the notion of humanity to, in this case, include a cat. I know a little language of my cat, though Dante says that animals have no need of speech, and nature abhors the superfluous. My cat is fluent. He converses when he wants with me. To speak is natural, and whales and wolves I've heard in choral soundings of the sea and air know harmony and have an eloquence that stirs my mind and heart. They touch the soul. It's in his animal communication man is true, immediate, and in immediacy, man is all animal. Moved by the recordings of the songs of wolves and whales and dolphins that were just then entering popular culture, Duncan arrives at this fellow feeling with his cat, not through a study of interspecies communication, but rather through listening to his own deepest stirrings. Like Emerson and Whitman, Duncan believes in a self with a capital S, which resides in the individual but provides access to the whole. From within this shared identity, one may identify with everything. In his final essay on Whitman, The Adventure of Whitman's Line, Duncan places himself directly in Whitman's line, his lineage of self-discovery, and thus finds himself again in Dante's company. It is my sense that Whitman saw his work to be to generate the adventure of being oneself first, and from that would come into view new quests, new horizons, for this new self was but a new discovery of the need for self, for the imagination to go on to the function it has in the creative intention Dante calls God's art. For it is the experience of each new self, and in the realm of poetry of each poet coming into his identity there, that he must create, imagine, and realize, have as his project, the large commonality in which he will have his hearing. Duncan does not more establish a song of myself than did Dante or Shakespeare. This crux of self, of one's very unique existence as such, is always there in the tension between speaking oneself and the utter commonality of the language that must be the medium of that self. But he brings it forward into the central drive, the imperative of a self-consciousness primary to the poem that it be born anew. In his writing, Duncan recurs to Dante and Whitman and Shakespeare again and again, because these poets hold open an aperture that leads to his own sense of identity, both as poet and as person. For as Emerson notes, the poet, by maintaining fidelity to experience, is more himself than any other person can be. And the poet likewise answers the call to speak the truth of experience, that is the responsibility of each person. In his essay, The Poet, Emerson writes, "The poet is representative. He stands among partial men for the complete man, and apprises us not of his wealth, but of the commonwealth. The young man reveres men of genius because, to speak truly, they are more himself than he is. For all men live by truth and stand in need of expression. The man is only half himself. The other half is his expression." In the Dante Etudes, Duncan writes a song of myself by probing Dante's essays for expressions that open onto the truth of the commonwealth for our time. In line with Whitman, Duncan believes this commonwealth to be democratic and to include all poets, all people, and all species in an ensemble beyond the boundaries of poetic schools, of nations, or even of Homo sapiens. His reading of Dante leads Duncan to the recognition that man is all animal, and that a biological vernacular speaks to a politics of respect and inclusion, in which the individual identity is not a shelter for defensive protection, but a gateway through experience to the commonwealth. Why, finally, does Duncan bring Dante and Whitman into such an extended colloquy within his own work? Well, perhaps Emerson again explains it best. In his investigation of the function of the poet, he proclaims, "Dante's praise is that he dared to write his autobiography in colossal cipher or into universality." But then Emerson laments that American poets are too pallidly parochial and ultimately blind to the world before them. "We have had yet no genius," he says, "in America, with tyrannous eye, which knew the value of our incomparable materials." Generations of readers have seen Walt Whitman as the poet who answered this call, who both knew the value of our incomparable materials and dared to write his autobiography in colossal cipher. In this way, he rose, as I hope my Notre Dame students would grasp, to the position of centrality in American poetry and culture that Dante holds in Italian poetry and culture. Returning to their works anew amid the political and ecological crises of the 1970s, Duncan is moved not to found again a national poetry, but to creatively read the foundational poets in a way that imagines a world and an art in which we would want to live, in which conflict and discord might reach a higher harmony in what he calls heart. As he proclaims in the poem The Work, another poem based in his readings from the Monarchia, "That there be heart, a harmony large enough to account for conflict, and the adequate concept seen to provide contrast, the artist rejoices in." Thank you very much.